you want to share with us today 5 landmarks which point to a young Earth.
Well, I thought it'd be good to look at the Tibetan Plateau, the Grand Canyon, the Three Sisters, Uluru, previously known as Ayers Rock. Finally, we'll have a look at Mount Everest.
Marine fossils on Mount Everest. Is this proof of the global flood?
Marine fossils are on Mount Everest, but more importantly, they're also in Mount Everest, and both are evidence of a global flood.
Australia's most famous rock caused by a global flood. Really?
The argument that it's millions of years old falls apart quite rapidly. The rock should have fallen apart long ago, but it hasn't.
Well, there certainly is a lot of evidence with all these different 5 landmarks pointing towards the global flood and a young Earth. Can you piece it all together?
Let me put all that together for you now then.
Many geologists today say that landmarks such as the Grand Canyon or Mount Everest point to millions of years. But my guest here today says that these landmarks point to a much younger Earth. Ron, you want to share with us today 5 landmarks which point to a young Earth. But before we get into that, what sort of qualifications do you have? Why should we listen to you about this?
Yes, qualifications are that for 35 years I was a research academic working around the world. I held professorships in 3 different continents, in fact, in Europe and Asia and Australia. Researching in landforms, researching in floods, researching to some extent in both coastal, fluvial, flood environments as well, and published many international publications in top journals as well. So 35 years of experience, I hope, helps a few people understand what I'm about to say.
Well, it sounds like we've got the right person. So can you tell us what these 5 landmarks, or sounds like landforms is another way to say it. What are these 5 that we're going to look at today?
Well, I thought it'd be good to look at the Tibetan Plateau, the Grand Canyon, which always attracts interest, the Three Sisters, which are rock formation found in Australia, Uluru, which is previously known as Ayers Rock, also in Central Australia, and then finally we'll have a look at Mount Everest.
Okay, well, let's start with landmark number 1. Tell us about the Tibetan Plateau.
Well, the Tibetan Plateau is the largest and the highest plateau in the world. In fact, it's about 2,500 kilometres in one direction and 1,000 kilometres in the other direction. That's giving you about 2.5 million square kilometres. But it's not just its extent, it's also about 5,000 metres deep as well. So that's a lot of sediment that makes up that Tibetan Plateau.
Wow, that's quite a large scale. So tell us about how the Tibetan Plateau formed.
Well, given the massive amount of sediment, we know it couldn't have been formed by natural everyday processes. You will not see that amount of sediment, which is phenomenal, being deposited by any flood today, no matter where you are. And I have worked, as I've indicated, in various parts of the world, including the Amazon. So you will not see that sort of pattern of sediment. So it is massive. And for that to occur, I'm going to argue, therefore, that it had to occur during a catastrophic event of a global nature. So I'm going to argue that it occurred during Noah's flood.
Okay, so why can't we, assume that these, rocks and geological formations like the plateau, why can't they just have built up over millions of years, like we often hear geologists say?
We do hear that. When you look closely at the sedimentary structures in the Tibetan Plateau and other plateaus as well, what you're going to find is the bedding planes and the crossbedding and so on are of a significantly large size, indicating that the flow rate, the flow volume was massive. If you look at floodplains today, as I have in the Amazon River, and that's one of the largest rivers we do have, the patterns of bedding they leave or cross-bedding they leave are minor, incredibly minor compared to what you're seeing in these plateaus. So that's a significant feature, is that the layers are not being replicated today.
So just so I understand, you're saying that smaller floods have certain features that are different, after the flood, the evidence you see after the flood, like rocks here and formations there, you're saying they look a little bit different to what we see in the larger scale features like the Tibetan Plateau, wouldn't that actually, say or be evidence to say that, well, the plateau was not formed by a flood?
Well, my argument is not that they are different features, but rather they are of different scale. So when you look at crossbedding we know categorically is created by flowing water. So when you see crossbedding of a magnitude in the plateaus and other features, you know that the rate of flow and the volume of flow was significantly higher, but it is still flowing water. It is still from a flood deposit.
If you're enjoying this interview so far, you might be interested to know that we also produce the world's most widely read magazine on the creation-evolution debate, Creation Magazine. It's packed with beautifully illustrated articles showing how real science supports the Bible. It's designed for the whole family and is a great tool for strengthening your faith. Sign up now to receive 4 issues per year. Follow the link in the description. Are there any other features that you see in the Tibetan Plateau which point to a young Earth?
Oh, yes, absolutely. When you look at a current floodplain, you will see evidence of what we call bioturbation. Bioturbation is the physical evidence and impact of biological activity, whether it's plant roots or organisms burrowing in the ground and so on. So whenever you would have noticed yourself, whenever you see sediment deposited somewhere, it'll only be a matter of weeks before vegetation is growing on it or animals are disturbing it or whatever. And you'll see that in every modern floodplain. Now, if you lay more sediment on top of that, as the geologists would argue, and you lay it again and again, then you would trap the biological evidence in the layers. Unfortunately, when we look at these massive plateaus and other sedimentary beds elsewhere, we don't find evidence of significant biological or what we call bioturbation at all. And I think another point too, just to add to that, is that if the argument is these plateaus are hundreds of millions of years old, I'm going to ask a very simple question. How come their surfaces are still flat? In fact, it's actually written in the academic literature that the Tibetan Plateau's flatness, if we can call it that, is remarkable after so many hundreds of millions of years. So I'd put all those arguments together to say it's not a long age feature.
Right. So the flatness, I imagine that's because if you've got millions of years, there's lots of rivers and gorges and things happening over time.
Exactly.
And you get an uneven surface.
It should have been carved up. It should have been a dissected landscape, but it's not. It's still a plateau.
Right. Okay. Well, let's look at landmark number 2, which is one that a lot of people know about, the Grand Canyon. Tell us about that.
Oh, the Grand Canyon is exciting. I have been there once, and I remember being awed and excited and terrified, in fact, because I was standing on the metal staircase going to the bottom, and the metal staircase started to rattle and shake, and I got awfully worried about all of that because the dimensions of the Grand Canyon are absolutely incredible. I've got a few figures here just to help understand all that, just to give you some idea. So the Grand Canyon is essentially roughly about 460 kilometres in length or 290 miles in length. That's pretty big. That's impressive. Its depth varies from about 900 metres to 1,800 metres deep. And the canyon rim, by the way, is about 6.4 to 29 kilometres wide. Now, that's a significant piece of information. What does that mean? It means that somewhere in the order of 3,000 to over 4,000 cubic metres of sediment has been removed. Sorry, I will correct myself on that. Not cubic metres, 3,000 to over 4,000 cubic kilometres of sediment. Cubic kilometres of sediment.
Metres wouldn't be that much.
No, metres doesn't excite me.
Yeah.
But when I'm standing on the edge of a cliff face looking at, 4,000 or whatever it is, cubic kilometres of sediment that have been removed, it's inspiring.
That's huge. It's hard to even visualise a cubic kilometre. Like imagine you've walked up like a skyscraper that's a kilometre. I don't know if there is one that high. And then, wow, that's a lot. So, how do geologists explain the formation of the Grand Canyon at the moment? Because I imagine that's a bit different to what you say. How do they explain it?
Well, essentially, if you look on the web or academic articles, what you're going to find is that long ages are going to be invoked or proposed. In other words, Some will promote uniformitarianism, that it's been a slow and regular process over years. Others might promote that there might have been a little bit of a catastrophe here and another one there and so on. But essentially, they are looking at long ages. That is the current idea. And so in other words, the current rivers created that with millions of years.
Right. And what are the problems with this idea?
I guess a good starting point is the Grand Canyon cuts through a number of plateaus rather than going around them. Now, that just doesn't seem logical. And again, when you read the academic literature, I'll give you a quote here from one academic scientist who was caught off guard by this. He said, oddly enough, the Grand Canyon is located in a place where it seemingly shouldn't be. In other words, why didn't the river that carved this Grand Canyon, why didn't it go around the plateaus rather than cutting through multiple plateaus?
Yeah. Okay. So it's just to visualize this, it'd be like having, I don't know, like a mountain or a hill there today and a river, with water, let's say a lot of rain comes along and you get like a bit of a creek or a river flowing, and normally it would flow around the valleys around the outside, but the water just all of a sudden decides it's going to plow right through the middle of it instead.
Yes,
that
and that
doesn't make sense.
That's why we do call it a water gap as well, the Grand Canyon. It's a canyon, but it's also a water gap. And how that is created, it's not done by regular flowing waters. Flood waters will follow topography. But a catastrophic event doesn't follow topography. The turbulence and the velocity allow it to override the topography or the relief.
So it's the catastrophic event that you really need to explain that sort of feature.
Exactly.
So what other problems are there with the mainstream science understanding of the Grand Canyon and how it came to be?
Well, I guess when I stood there, your eyes focus on this incredible canyon. You look down, it's deep, it's sharp, it's brilliant. What you often don't realise, though, that's not just the only part of the canyon. There is a much larger, broader canyon that sits higher up. In other words, there's a much wider canyon, shallower, but broad, incredibly big in size. And then you have the Grand Canyon cutting into that as well. So in other words, this canyon is massive. Now, you cannot create the larger one with the same flow that you create the smaller one. The larger canyon indicates a much significantly, awesome flow that over time diminished, and then it cut down into a deeper canyon with lesser runoff.
Right. So how do you explain the formation of the upper canyon, the one that you can't explain with just normal flows we see today?
Well, I would argue that it was the concentration of the floodwaters as they came off the rising landscape. When water flows off a landscape, it starts first as a general flow, but as it begins to move, it begins to form, as you know, little rills and then gullies and then streams and so on. But if that water flowing off is massive, it will form gorges, massive gorges. But then as the water continues to decline in the volume, then it will start to form smaller gorges within the larger gorge. And so in the end then, you've left with a very minor river relative to the size of the double canyon. And doesn't explain, even in hundreds of millions of years, how that amount of land that we mentioned before, of all those cubic kilometres, thousands of cubic kilometres of sediment have been eroded.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit more about the gorge formation process? So you've got floodwaters, they're receding, and I imagine, is it a bit like a plateau to start with? And then you get gorges afterwards? What's the step-by-step process?
Yes, you're on the right track there, Michael. The plateaus are there. And you can see that when you look at the actual canyon itself. You will see the sedimentary strata. When you stand on the edge of the plateau, shaking and hanging onto a piece of metal, you will actually see the layers of the sediment that have been placed there as well. So you're seeing the depositional part of which created the plateau, and then you are seeing the incredible canyons as the runoff, as the plateau rose up out of the landscape, as it rose up, as the Lord raised it with his hands, the water rushes off and then begins to concentrate and form canyons, not just one, but many canyons. If you look at plateaus all around the world, in fact, you're going to see gorges coming off most of them.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I think it's time we look at landmark number 3. And I think I've actually seen this before. It's the Three Sisters. Now, I remember when I was younger, my family went to a place called the Blue Mountains in New South Wales in the country of Australia. And we went for this nice bushwalk, and eventually we got to a spot where there was a bit of a lookout over what looked like quite a large gorge even. You know, the area with, you got mountains with, or like ridge lines with sharp cliff faces at the top,
Yes.
and a lot of trees underneath. And then there were these big 3 rock pillars, and I think they call them the Three Sisters. I think those were the ones. Can you tell us more about the Three Sisters?
Yes, the Three Sisters are in the Katoomba region, what I call the Katoomba Gorge. That's not its real name, but I like to give it that name because it is a gorge, just as we mentioned a moment ago, and in other plateaus. So these Three Sisters sit on the side of a gorge which has cut into a plateau in eastern New South Wales, around Sydney. And so they're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful. They're sedimentary. You can actually look at them and you'll see the bedding that's in them. And there are 3 of them sitting there as pillars, sedimentary pillars, on the edge of the canyon. Now, it's not just here you'll see them. You'll see them in many locations around the world on the edge of canyons. This one just happens to be a particularly attractive one.
Yeah. So you mentioned sediment and bedding. Some interesting terminology. Can you explain that a little bit more to us?
Yes, the bedding is when you've got the sedimentary layers placed down. I think the term that probably needs expansion is crossbedding. Crossbedding is when you have water moving sediment, and it's the crossbedding indicates that the sediment is not being deposited in lateral lines; it's being slightly inclined, and that comes about because the sediment is moving down, being pushed up, and then dropping over in a sedimentary bed like that. So you're getting this this flow of, so they're called crossbeddings. So when you look at if you've ever seen a road cutting and you see everything looking nice and uniform, we can call that bedding or stratum. Yeah. But if you see it tilted, and then there's another layer on top that's like that, and this one tilted, where it's tilted, that's crossbedding most likely.
Right.
And now the crossbedding is a very good feature because we can use that to determine both the direction of flow of the water that put that there, that sediment there, but we can also use it to determine the rate of flow by which it was put there. And so that's very useful. Now, in the case of the Three Sisters, it turned out that the rate of flow was incredible. I think I've got some statistics here that will help me with all of that because this was published again, and I refer to academic journals all the time, and I love reading all these sort of things. It would have been a wall of water estimated by a university in Sydney, by staff there, 20 metres high, a wall of water, 250 kilometres wide. Now, that's a very large river, and having worked on the Amazon, we don't see that. So 250 kilometres wide, 20 metres deep, coming down from the north at an enormous speed to create the crossbeds that you see in the Three Sisters and the surrounding cuttings of the gorge, of the plateau itself, into the plateau. So we know then that the area, the crossbedding indicates that it wasn't a placid or quiet environment for deposition of sediment. That plateau, just like the Grand Canyon Plateau, was laid down under catastrophic processes with incredible speeds of water and walls of water coming down in waves.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned that in a paper that someone's written, some scientific research. Out of interest, did they talk about the Great Flood at all, or did they have some other explanation for that big wall of water?
Oh no, you won't hear of floods of that magnitude. People will write papers on big floods, and I've written them too, because I've studied large floods. And so I've even written a paper on the 1974 Brisbane floods and so on. And I've worked on the Amazon and travelled down the Yangtze and all the rest. But nobody invokes a catastrophic flood of that magnitude. You see, when they talk about a flood, they're talking essentially about a catchment flood within a catchment.
Yeah.
But no flood within a catchment will ever generate that amount of runoff, even in the Amazon, to create those sort of features that I'm talking about, the cross-bedding or the bedding and the depth of sediment that's going on and so on. So It can't come from that. I would argue it's not even a regional flood. I would argue it's not even derived from a continental flood.
It's got to
I
be
think
global,
those features,
isn't
it has to be global to give you those sort of features, those dimensions and those characteristics of the sediments and the way they're deposited.
Right. So they might try to point to a regional or even continental, but they don't want to go near a global flood because I guess they know what that probably means.
No, they tend to stay away from a global flood.
Yeah. That's a shame. Hopefully, it's, people can, when they see this evidence, like yourself, eventually come to be aware of, the true history. But,
Yes.
We can, pray for that. So, can you just summarize for us, just paint a picture for us, the three sisters, how they formed, just in a simple terms, how they formed from the Great Flood?
Let me summarise all three together because they are connected. In other words, we've had massive sedimentary deposits of incredible scale that require catastrophic flooding. There's no argument. That was uplifted, and as the water rushed off the landscape, what it then did is concentrated and then created gorges. But not just one gorge. Multiple gorges would often be created by the multiple tributaries, the multiple drainage systems coming down together. And where you get the violence and the velocities and the magnitude of the turbulence going on, particularly when two gorges come together, that's when you get features like the Three Sisters. They're actually sitting on where two gorges, or a minor gorge and a larger gorge, come together. And it's in that chaos of that water with its turbulence and velocity again that you'll create these sort of remarkable features such as the Three Sisters.
Thanks, Ron. That makes a lot of sense. So we've looked at the Grand Canyon, we've looked at the Tibetan Plateau, we've looked at the Three Sisters in Australia. Landmark number 4, we're looking at Uluru, or Ayers Rock in Australia. Tell us about that.
Well, Uluru is a feature that, from a earth scientist point of view, we like to call an Inselberg.
Inselberg. That sounds like it's from the movie Titanic. What's an Inselberg?
It actually has almost a connection to the Titanic because an Inselberg is a rock feature, if you like, sitting above a plain. And they can be extremely large rock features sitting above a flat plain around it. And you'll often find, in fact, they are like ice, that they can be actually larger underneath than they are above.
Right.
And
so
that's
like
often a mistake we make. We look at a landform feature or landmark feature such as Uluru and we'll say, wow, that's impressive. But that's only the tip of the iceberg, as you put it.
Yeah.
Another example, of course, just to put it into context, is Devil's Tower in the USA. That also is an Inselberg.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. So let's talk more about Uluru. Tell us more about this big red rock in the middle of Australia. What's so significant about it?
Oh, it's big. Now, it's a beautiful colour. It's made of arkose, which is a sandstone, and within that you'll get feldspars and so on. So you get that colour. And I have been there because I was there once as an advisor for the federal government looking at how to use that land and how to protect that land. And it rained on the Ayers Rock. And when it rains on Ayers Rock, all the colours just light up the sky, beautiful colours and so on. So it is beautiful. But the point about Ayers Rock, it's not, whilst it's a sedimentary rock, a sandstone, it's not lying like that, as you see in the landscape. It's actually being tilted like that. It's actually at an 80-degree angle. So what you see as sticking out of the ground then goes down into the ground, and Ayers Rock is actually 6 kilometres deep.
Wow, that's a long way down.
You're only seeing the surface. It's 6 kilometres deep. It's amazing.
I hope you're enjoying this interview so far. Creating content like this takes a considerable amount of time, effort, and resources. We're passionate about getting this message out, and we want to keep bringing you videos like this one. But here's the thing, we need your help to make that happen. Your support, no matter how big or small, will help us cover our production costs and enable us to continue creating impactful content. To support this project, just use the link in the description below or the on-screen prompt. We're so thankful for your support. So you mentioned it's very deep and some other features. What does that say about the age of Uluru?
Well, in the literature, it is argued and published these days that Uluru is probably around 350 million years old. That's the argument. I feel challenged by that because when you look carefully at the actual sandstone and the mineralogy of that, it's an Arco sandstone with a lot of feldspar. Now, feldspar, when exposed to the atmosphere, doesn't take it too long to start to weather, to break down, if you like. It'll be dull. It'll start to, rapidly decay into a clay, in which case then the binding of the sandstone starts to fall apart. Now, we don't see that on the surface of Uluru. What we see there is feldspar that looks wonderful. It doesn't look as though it's been weathered. It doesn't look as though it's breaking down. And yet the argument is that it's been there for 350 million years. Well, we know, though, that when feldspar is exposed to the atmosphere, particularly a humid atmosphere, a wet atmosphere, also high temperatures, then it will start to break down reasonably rapidly, certainly not taking 350 million years to break down. I would have expected then that the Ayers rock would have actually weathered away long ago, long before 350 million years.
Okay, but the location of Uluru, it doesn't seem like a very humid place.
No, that's correct. But I think it's still stretching the argument 350 million years, because even in even in a drier environment, one without the intense humidity you might get elsewhere, you're still going to see the breakdown of feldspar. It's still going to happen. It's not going to take 350 million years. Also, it clashes with existing arguments about inland Australia, where over 350 million years it hasn't been arid. It's actually been other climatic zones as well, and inland seas. All sorts of things have happened. So again, I think it's stretching the imagination to argue that the particular sandstone with its feldspar is still sitting there looking prime rather than decaying.
Right, so even though it's not very humid today, if you assume 350 million years of history, the climate's changing and you've got
even without the humidity, you would still see change.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
so it's not a very strong point.
Not a strong point.
Yeah. Well, in your opinion then, how was Uluru exposed? How did it get to the spot, get to the way it looks like today?
Well, Uluru is a more, let's say it's a more resistant rock than the surrounding terrain, the geology of the surrounding area. The surrounding rocks are more easily weathered. And so one would have expected, first of all, that those rocks would have decayed or broken apart more rapidly, and Uluru being more resistant to that. But equally, given the surrounding area is a lovely plain, it again comes back to a global flood, that as the land is raised up and the waters are washing away all those rocks that are actually susceptible, then it's taken away the weak rock around it, and what's left is a bit of strong rock in the middle called an Inselberg or Uluru. I think it's a simple explanation, because that flat plain is extensively large.
Right. So yeah, it really is just it'd be like when you've got I think I remember when I used to do kayaking at the Brisbane River, we had a bit of a flood that went on, and there were certain areas where you'd have the bank of the river sort of covered in sediment, and then after the flood, certain spots got eroded, but there were some rock features which stayed there and sort of poked their head up above the sediment. So it's a bit like that, but on a large scale.
Yes. So to me, it again comes back to evidence of a biblical flood, that a vast quantity of sediment or vast quantity of rock has been removed in the weaker geology, leaving these features, which are more resistant rock, standing there as beautiful icons, beautiful landmarks.
Excellent. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Now, we've done 4 landmarks so far. We've got one more to go. What's the 5th landmark that points to a young Earth?
Well, I thought we'd raise the topic of Mount Everest. Now, I've chosen that deliberately because one of the fascinating questions I get asked when I travel around Australia and I might speak at churches or youth groups, one of the more common questions I'm asked is, where did the floodwaters go? If there was a biblical flood, where did the floodwaters go? And I'd ask the question, what do you mean, where did the floodwaters go? Well, they go, well, if they covered Mount Everest, where did they go? And it's an interesting question, but what it does, I think, it reflects a inability of the person to understand that Mount Everest wasn't there.
Wait, you're saying, so Mount Everest, 4,500 years ago, just before the flood, you don't think it was there? How do you explain that?
Mount Everest is, again, sedimentary, but very much a limestone with some shales and all this sort of thing, particularly up the top. But it is riddled with fossils, marine fossils. Absolutely. It's all the way through. So when youth groups or parishioners ask me, well, if it was there, I would say, where would you find the fossils? And they'd say you'd find them on the outside. I said, yes. But why do we then find them all the way through Mount Everest? Why do we find them inside Mount Everest? And you get the mind then thinking, going, oh, okay, perhaps it wasn't there. Perhaps it was part of the sediments that were eroded during the flood, placed on the ocean floor, filled with trillions of fossils, mainly marine, mainly quite small, and then raised up from there. In other words, we're misjudging the height of the flood by saying Everest was there at the time of the flood. My argument, it was not. Why? Because it's riddled with marine fossils.
Yeah, and you'd have to be below sea level to have marine life can't just start walking up mountains. It's got to be underwater.
Yes, and the fact that the marine fossils are all through it.
Yeah.
It catches people off guard and they go, oh, okay, which then opens up the mind that the landscape did change dramatically, and these landmarks that appeared that we've been talking about are actually a result of that interaction of the flood and the uplift and then the erosion that occurred all within a very short period of time.
Well, there certainly is a lot of evidence with all these different 5 landmarks pointing towards the global flood and a young Earth. Can you summarise them all together? Because I remember earlier you mentioned, I think it was the 3 sisters. You actually put that in context of gorges or canyons and plateaus as well. So now we've got mountains. Can you piece it all together just so we can think about, the Great Flood and how it would have caused all these landmarks?
Well, one of the blessings I had was travelling the world. And so I was able to see patterns around the world. So I was different to potentially a lot of scientists who might be studying one feature in one location, trying to explain it in the sense of that location. My problem was, how do I explain patterns of similarity around the world? So when I gave you the example of the Tibetan Plateau, it's just one plateau. Plateaus occupy 40% of the continents, 45%, 60% of Africa. And so when I started to look at all these different landmarks, and each of them pointed towards a commonality around the globe, but a commonality in their formation rather than a different argument for every location, I began to see a tapestry, a woven tapestry of how the Earth has been shaped as a result of a global flood. So sort of like the Bible. The Bible is a tapestry woven together. So too is our planet. Its features, whether they be Tibetan Plateau or gorges, all indicate a global flood. Let me put all that together for you now then. Massive flood tears this planet apart. Absolutely rips it apart. There is no Mount Everest. The whole thing is torn apart. Deposited, and the water flow at this stage now would have been about 3 kilometres deep over all of the sedimentary and remaining bedrock features on the planet. 3 kilometres deep. Massive amounts of sediment that we would never see being deposited by rivers today, filled with trillions of fossils. And we cannot even find those fossils being created today. We don't have the sediment that need to create those fossils. But the point is then, they are lifted up. As the Lord said, I will raise the land and lower the sea floor. As that land is raised, we get these incredible plateaus as it's raised up because it's sedimentary strata. Some of it is tilted, like Uluru, but most of it comes up like this. So you're creating plateaus. But as the water runs off from the flood, what you then have is it concentrates into gorges and valleys and carves them up, leaving beautiful features along the edges of the gorges. So you've got massive plateaus, deep gorges, as we've seen, even in Tibet. It's 3 to 4 kilometres deep at least, those gorges, with incredible features like the 3 sisters in the Katoomba Gorge area in there. And then some of these sedimentary rocks, as the floodwaters continue to run off, removing all the weaker rocks and the sediment, left Inselbergs, beautiful features, testimony of the massive removal of the sediment around them, the rock around them, because they're weaker rocks and all of that. And then even when you step away from the plateaus and all the features attached to the plateaus, and I could go into many more as well, even if you then turn your attention to the mountain ranges, you will find that the mountain ranges around the world are riddled with fossils all through them. Whether you're in the Andes, the Himalayas, doesn't matter where you are, in the Rockies, they are riddled with fossils basically all through. And so therefore we know they were formed down, they rose up at certain points, create spectacular mountain ranges, but they did so after the great flood when the Lord raised it with his hand.
Yeah, actually, I've got one more question. You talk about the Lord raising the mountains and things like that, and I guess it's almost a bit poetic language, but can that be explained in terms of the mechanism that God used, I guess, by tectonics? Is that something that I've heard that before? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, we have a lot of discussion in the Creation Ministries International on our website on plate tectonics, and there's a lot more to learn because you are talking about processes quite deep in the planet. And so there is little doubt that the plate tectonics has roles to play, and we have interesting discussions amongst ourselves as to how that occurred and so on. But certainly plate tectonics is a feature of all of this because we also had volcanic activity, we had shifting of plates and all that sort of thing. Again, we need to be very careful how to interpret the movements of plates. We always make the mistake, I feel, as scientists. We measure something today and we assume it was the same rate before. We constantly make that mistake by measuring a process today. So with plate tectonics, we have a long time to wait because it's a very slow process. So by the time we actually measure any change in the rate, whether it's declining or increasing, that's too far away. But no, it is an important part, again, of these features.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting side note. It's probably even a topic for a whole nother interview. So I might, for listeners who are interested, maybe they can just check out creation.com.
Creation.com.
I'm sure there's plenty of information there.
Yes.
But thanks so much for sharing about all these different landmarks. I thought that was fascinating.
My pleasure.
There's a lot of things where I think just when I'm going on long car trips on the road, even seeing the crossbedding, in the middle of the cutouts when you drive through, and even I know where I am. There's a few different mountain-like features which have that flood sort of aspect to them, or geology, which I think I'll think about differently now when I pass them.
Yes.
And consider, how does that fit into the Great Flood?
Yes. I've been told by numerous people who I've shared this message with that they can no longer go into the landscape and admire its beauty. They are too busy now trying to work out how the flood carved this part or that part or this part. So
they can't unsee it.
Can't unsee it. It's there. And it becomes more obvious the more you study this and the more you look at it from another perspective, from a biblical perspective, you see it. It's clear cut.
Now, you mentioned creation.com before, which is a great place for people to learn about these landmarks and many other things. But there's also another resource that I'm aware of, which is Creation Magazine. So we have this, which comes out, I think it's 4 times a year, and it's just full of great articles. A lot of these articles written by scientists with qualifications. Can you tell us more about Creation Magazine and the things we could read in it?
Oh, absolutely. This is probably our most significant connecting to the community. It is a brilliant magazine. So this particular issue is the latest issue at this time of filming, and in 2024. And surprisingly, as we talk about landmarks and land features and so on, is that even in this, as you see there is an article on Devil's Tower, the one I mentioned earlier.
I remember that, yeah.
And so each issue will have something to do with earth science and geology. It'll have something to do with biology or ecosystems, something to do with astrophysics. A children's section will interview people who are just incredible Christians who believe in creation. The quality of it is astounding. And the little short articles, longer articles, all the rest. Oh, there's a megalodon article as well. Now, that's going to attract a lot of attention from young people. They love these sorts of articles. And I love them, and I will highlight that they are written to the highest standards. And I know that as an academic. Why? Because I could publish anything I want in a top journal almost immediately. But my first article to the Creation magazine had to be rewritten 4 times because it had to be exact. It had to be communicatable to the public, not to academics like myself. It had to be scripturally correct. And so I had to redo my first article with Creation magazine 4 times. And I loved it because being able to connect with people, as this magazine does, is a powerful feature. And we have people within Creation Ministries, and my wife and I do the same thing. We will give this away to people who are seeking a connection to Christ. Creation is a big issue that is being discussed by young people today, seeking their identity, seeking their purpose, uncertain of why they're here. What is it they're asking? They're asking, why was I created? What is my purpose in life? This magazine is attractive to them. And so I recommend, if you are a member and you have purchased this magazine, first thing you do will be read it. Secondly, give it away. Give it away wherever you can. Even if it's in a hospital ward or a doctor's surgery, simply put it down, or a coffee shop, simply put it down. You'll be surprised how many people will come to us at Creation Ministries and say thank you.
Fantastic. If you want to get Creation Magazine, just check out the link below in the description and you'll be able to subscribe there. Thanks for joining us today, Ron. It was a pleasure to learn about landmarks and how they point to the global flood.
Thank you, Michael.